194 pages, full color, hardcover, dust jacket and all. Accidental Paradise, 13,000 years of history of Presque Isle. The newly published book features Presque Isle's natural history and colorful political history, including its creation as a state park in 1921. From Presque Isle's naval history to its ecology, to the story of the notorious Joe Root, from its lighthouses to the Perry Monument, from the Tom Ridge Environmental Center to Waldemere Park, from fishing, environmental issues, U.S. Coast Guard, and much, much, much more. Accidental Paradise is the result of a 3-year project that delves into the diverse history, the people and places, and major events of Presque Isle from the beginning to today. No easy feat, and features photographs, illustrations, charts, and maps. Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Speggen. I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson, and I am a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. And in this conversation, we're going to talk to the newly published book's authors, David Frew and Jerry Scripzak, as well as the book's chief editor, Pat Cuneo. An important note up front, folks, published by the Jefferson Educational Society, JES, in cooperation with the Tom Ridge Environmental Center Foundation. I want to thank the folks at the Trek for their partnership in this process, and I want to announce that they are handling the book sales throughout the end of the year. For information on how, where, and when to purchase the book, please do visit accidentalparadise.com. A brief bit about the authors and the editors before we get into this discussion. Dr. David Frew, the retired longtime professor and administrator at Gannon University, has written or co-written 40 books and more than 100 articles, cases, and papers. Most recently, he's authored the prolific On the Waterfront series for the Jefferson Educational Society, all of which is available and archived at jeserie.org. Mr. Jerry Scripps, a retired Erie police crime scene investigator, is the longtime president of the Save Our Native Species Sons of Lake Erie Fishing Advisory Group and is no stranger to JES programming himself. Mr. Patrick Cuneo, after a decades-long career as a journalist working as a reporter, editor, and columnist for the Erie Times News, now currently serves as the publication coordinator at the JES. For a fuller bio on each one of those outstanding individuals, please do visit jeserie.org. Now, since this program is first airing live on the Jefferson Educational Society's Facebook page, we're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comments section below. If you're watching or listening to a later broadcast of this event, please still feel free to send us questions, and we'll do our best to get them along to the authors and the editor. And for more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, do visit jeserie.org, and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. David Frew, Jerry Scripzak, Pat Cuneo, thank you for joining us for this conversation. So I want to get things started.
Hey, you're welcome.
Thank you so much, Jerry. So I'll get things started. Full disclosure, full transparency. I had the pleasure and the privilege of reading the book in advance and taking a look at it. One of the things that I appreciated right from the get-go was the intros that you, David and Jerry, offer. In your brief intro there in the book, David, you cover a lot. I mentioned in the intro of you, your On the Waterfront series. One of the things that I've come to appreciate about that is your introduction, at least to me for the first time, of what a bay rat is and getting to understand a bay rat. And I think that's such a great perspective that you've offered our audience. And I see a little bit of that in the intro. For those that don't know, first, give us the quick definition, quick character study of what a bay rat is, and then take us to that intro in Accidental Paradise. Because I'm interested in seeing it from your perspective. And then Jerry, I'm going to go to you because then I want to turn to you next and get your perspective of Presque Isle from a different vantage point. So David, start with you. Bay rat, what is it? Who are they? And how did that influence how you see Accidental Paradise, Presque Isle?
Oh, I grew up during the 1950s, early 50s, on the west side of Erie, within sight of the bay. Not in a flashy, fancy condo kind of thing that we think we see down there now, but in an ordinary flat. And for all of us kids, as soon as we were able to dig our way out of our household responsibilities, we made a beeline for the bay, because that's where all the great adventures were. Those are the things I've been writing about in the On the Waterfront column. I've been writing books about Lake Erie and ships and shipping and shipwrecks for a while. And my wife and I were sitting, hoping not to get busted by the Presque Isle cops in parking lot number 3, long after it was dark, waiting for the hunter's moon to rise. 3 years ago plus, that's the October moon. And as we were furtively hoping not to get a ticket from the Presque Isle cops, although we might be able to talk our way out of it, we were sitting talking about what my next book would be. I have a sort of an obsessive compulsive disorder with writing. And my wife, Marianne, who's a co-author, has written with me and known me well for, coming on 60 years. She understood that I was probably mulling around in my head the next thing to write. I had just published the last book. And we came to the conclusion that maybe something about Presque Isle would be appropriate. That's how it started.
So David, I thank you for that. In an early conversation and getting ready for this program, Jerry, I want to turn to you because I think you, somewhat jokingly, but I think accurately, a little bit of truth there, joked that if David's a bay rat, you might be a lake rat. So tell us about your vantage point of Presque Isle.
I was born and raised on Lighthouse Street, and that's the 400 block, probably a block, 2 blocks away from the lake. Every day as a young man and a kid, my gang would go down there and wander around the beach that was right off below the bluff off of Lighthouse Street. It was a really neat place. We had a different vantage point. We were outside the bay, and we could see the Presque Isle tip of the peninsula. And if I can recall back when I was about 10, 15 years old, that peninsula was an awful lot shorter than it is today. It's been growing and growing and growing throughout the whole time. But it was a different perspective. We were down by the water. There were a lot of things down there of dead fish and all kinds of pieces of shipwreck would drift on the shore. There were boathouses, and it was just a fun place to grow up. And on top of the bluff, by the Lighthouse, of course, the street was named Lighthouse Street. It was a small park, and it was actually set up for playing ball, except for one problem: if you hit a foul ball, it went over the fence and down the hill. Now, being kids, we only had one ball, so the game would stop until we could find a ball and finish the game up.
That sounds like a proper game of Sandlot baseball to me, if I've ever heard one. Pat, I want to welcome you into this too, because you're an Erie native as well. You're an East Sider, so your vantage point of Presque Isle and its connection to Lake Erie and its connection to Erie.
Well, first I'd like to say what a pleasure it was working with David and Jerry. This is a real labor of love that they have given to the Erie community. So that said, I am an East Sider. Born and bred, and if they're a bay rat and lake rat, I was a sewer rat. Up the street, I grew up on 21st Street, and then later 27th Street. Man, it would take us a half hour to get to the dock, and it would be an hour and a half and 3 bus trips, and you'd eat 5 sandwiches to get to the peninsula. But the more adventurous kids from my neighborhood would go down and then just try to swim off of the channel, which of course is about the most dangerous thing on earth. But I knew almost nothing about the peninsula except a once a year trip that I go with my family, and that was when relatives were in town, and so I learned it as a teen and as a young adult, and of course, who doesn't love it? And one last note: I was struck the first time I went to Cape Cod, and it's supposed to be so miraculous. I thought, my God, this is like the peninsula. So I've always had soft spot for the peninsula, but had to learn it. And now anybody who has ever stepped foot on the peninsula or seen it from high atop Erie would love this book.
I couldn't agree more, and we're so excited that it's about to be out. accidentalparadise.com. Information on how, when, where to get copies of that book. Information is going to be there. We'll have information on the jeserie.org website as well. I like that: a bay rat, a lake rat, and a sewer rat. My zodiac sign's a rat, and I grew up in the woods. Maybe I'm a wood rat. I don't know. You might adopt me. But I want to go, before we get into a deep dive of Accidental Paradise, to welcome people into this book and into this discussion. I'd be remiss if I didn't note that David and Jerry, this isn't your first rodeo together. So Jerry, I want to start with you. How did the two of you get started working together on these book projects?
It kind of started as a result of the Sons of Lake Erie, really. Dave and I went to high school together, and actually we worked together for a while at P.A. Myers. And I went to Gannon. And over the years, I worked my way in a position of being the president of the Sons 27 years ago. One of the things that we needed for our meetings was speakers. And every once in a while, Dave would come out with a book, and I'd invite Dave to talk. And Dave would put on a talk, and pretty soon he kind of instilled an interest in Erie's history with me. And I had been a photo collector for years, and I was able to help him out in some of his prior books, maybe with some photographs that he needed for those publications. So after a while, we decided to do one together on Erie's commercial fishing industry, which was really our first full book together. And then we just kind of evolved from there.
Yeah, I was going to say, David, if you don't mind, walk us through that catalog. I know Jerry says it, so well of, David, you put out another book and another book. And we mentioned that in the intro. You are a prolific author, but not all the books. We don't have time to get through them all today. But the ones that you and Jerry have worked on, could you walk us back through that past catalog quickly?
I'd like to start before that. I'd like to start with the fact that I've known Jerry as a master photographer for decades. And when I was teaching at Gannon, he was right across the street holding court in the police department. And if I needed anything, I knew that I could call him or walk over there, and he would, if he didn't have it, be able to get it. And or he would go out and find it and take it for me. So early on when I was doing books and I ran into a corner and I needed something, I would call Jerry and he would do it. So even though his name isn't on, a half a dozen or a dozen of the books that preceded the 5 that we did together, probably should be. If it wasn't for him, some of those early books that he did with the History Press in Charleston could not have happened. He was so incredibly generous and so incredibly patient. When the History Press would say, we can't use that photograph, it doesn't have enough pixels. And Jerry would say something like that, well, it was taken in 1917. They just didn't have enough pixels back then. You're going to have to make this work. Thanks again, Jerry.
And I love that stick-to-itiveness, and I can't understate just how wonderful this new book looks. And it's such a beautiful blending of a coffee table large format book with such rich writing and photography present in both of that. Fortune and Fury, I know, was a book that the two of you worked on. Was that the last book that the two of you worked on prior to Accidental Paradise,
no, we
David?
also did books. We did the Jefferson celebration of 2020, or sorry, 2012 or whatever year that was, book together. And we did the Porcupine book, and we did, what else we did? We did the Erie Canal book. And we've done a couple of articles together, actually. We did a nice one on the Mill Creek flood.
So it's so great to have the dynamic duo back together again for this, the 194-page book, Accidental Paradise. And I want to get into that. And looking at the second part of the title of the book, A 13,000 Year, and I repeated that twice because I think I'm still just blown away by the accomplishment in the intro, the 13,000 year multi-layered history. David, how do you start a 13,000 year history?
Well, you run out and start talking to all your friends that know so much more about the limnology and geology and geography than I could ever know. So as much as you'd like to credit me with writing this book, much of this book was written by other people, people whose names are throughout the book and or on the front page. My chief ally in the writing of this book was Harry Leslie, the longest serving superintendent at Presque Isle. And I might note that Harry and I worked on 3 other projects together when he was out there. We worked on the Gull Point project, we worked on the Gull Point education project, and Harry and I have become great friends. If it wasn't for Harry, I wouldn't have been able to get my nose in all the places that I went.
And a big thanks to all of those folks. Again, names on the cover, you're going to find them throughout the book, and to be able to see that Jerry, I've got to ask, from all of the projects you've worked with David on, when David comes to you and says, Jerry, I've got an idea, we're going to write about Presque Isle, it's going to be a 13,000 year history. What was your reaction in response to that?
Well, it was an exciting idea. I know there's been a lot of books written about Presque Isle, and some of them are very good. And having a different insight between Dave and I is one of the reasons I thought we should go ahead of it. I've had a lot of experience working at Presque Isle. We do a lot of volunteer, the Central Lake Erie, except for this year, of course. We're out there at least once a week throughout the summer. We take about 1,000 kids fishing every year. And during that time, I get an opportunity to work with the staff. And they've got a wonderful staff of environmental educators, especially Brian Gula. And Brian is a real history buff, and so am I. So we've always had, hey, listen, let's do this, let's do that. Plus, I've been volunteering as a historian on the Pennsylvania Archaeological Shipwreck Survey team out of the Regional Science Consortium. So we're working with Brian on that. And so it was really, really kind of a fun, because there's a lot of interesting. We got a chance to not only experience the park, but experience the people that work there.
So, Pat, this is my totally biased opinion because I get the pleasure of working with you every day at the Jefferson. I think you're one of the best in the business when it comes to editing. And if anybody is equipped to take on a project like this, to edit a 13,000 year book, I think it's you. But what was your immediate reaction when you found out, hey, this is something you're going to be working on, putting a lot of time in, editing a 13,000 year history of Erie's greatest asset? What was your reaction?
Well, my reaction was, a lot of the work, much of the work was done before I was even on scene. And a lot of those crucial decisions had already been made. But the biggest one, I thought, was the storytelling method that David, you use so well. And also, Jerry, you illustrate so well, because when it comes down to it, we like to tell stories. It's the best way to convey material. And as a result, because clearly the priority was on storytelling, that David was able to translate a lot of very technical information into a very readable narrative, very fun, very interesting. And then the one other thing I would note is the context. Again and again, the detailed context of what this place means, starting with my first question, David, for you would be, in the natural history, you explain these wonderful details like the Wisconsin Glacier and its movement to and fro, creating what had been two lakes. How did you come across, and who worked with you on that part, the natural history, basically to get this all kicked off?
Well, I had the good fortune of hooking on to a shipwreck analysis team that was anchored by a geologist, a Canadian geologist. We spent 4 days together on a ship, trying to figure out where we were going to run the pipeline that went from Ontario Hydro someplace to this side of the lake without messing up any artifacts. And the two kind of artifacts that he was concerned about were shipwrecks and or ice scours, other features on the bottom of the lake. So that was like a master's degree in geology for me, being with him during that time. He taught me so much, and he wouldn't stop talking. He was a great guy. His name was Blasco, of all things.
Yeah. Well, on that same point, people know that many people in Erie know that the peninsula is a sand spit, but I think they didn't get quite the relationship it had to Long Point, or that there was a big channel cutting across the lake right by us. That must be important for you to tell this contextual story.
Well, that's a limnology story that shocks people. They don't understand that there's no way of getting the water out of Lake Erie, and the water in Lake Erie doesn't fit down the Niagara River. So it rushes from west to east, southwest to northeast, actually. It's the Niagara River, turns around and comes back the other way. And the Pennsylvania Channel, which is just offshore from us, is a pressure valve, which helps to relieve that pressure. And its geological connection is that when Lake Erie was two lakes back in geological times, that was the connecting river between the two lakes.
Yeah, and similarly, contextually, you tell these wonderful Native American stories, dispelling a lot of myth, also straightening out, who was fierce and who really doesn't have fact behind their stories, etc. Why the emphasis did you feel it was needed to tell that?
Well, I have a long history with the people at the Six Nations Reserve at Brantford. I've been going there for years doing lots of different things and making friends and counting on them to know what how to answer questions. So when this project came up, I think I was there 4 or 5 times. Spent several nights overnight, not a problem for me, at the Erie Beach Hotel while I was commuting back and forth, listening to them explain to me the real history of Native Americans, all the tribes that went around the lake and traded with each other, and the impact of the Iroquois on the Eries.
Yeah, well, any big surprises for you when you're dispelling the myths that have been in Erie history books since the 1840s when we first had history books?
Well, we've learned a lot lately because of genetics. And the biggest shocker here that's just popped up lately is that the Eries probably were not the original hunter-gatherers that came this way, like the rest of the tribes, like, for example, the Seneca just south of us. The Eries probably were a tribe that went into Mexico and decided it was too busy and turned around and came back this way. And what we know about the Eries from the brief European contact they had with the French was that they were dramatically taller, bigger, and more athletic than all the other natives in this area. In fact, they were sort of distrusted and not liked because every year they won the Iroquois games that took place where the Kinzu Dam is now.
Well, very interesting. Jerry, this is like a nightmare handing that kind of material to a photographic, whether a historian or not, to illustrate these concepts. How did you go about doing that?
Pat, I couldn't. I'm not getting really good sound. Can you repeat the question, please?
How did you illustrate those tough subjects compared to being able to go out and photograph or gather photographs of the modern peninsula?
Well, a lot of things that are available. There's a lot of illustrations available online. Dave and I have used this kind of a dialogue before because when we did Fortune and Fury, we talked about glaciers and things like that. So it was something we're familiar with. We've both been looking at it now for several years. Brian Gula, the Presque Isle Park has a tremendous archive, and they've got a lot of maps that you can study. So it was fairly easy.
That's good to hear.
And then there's a lot of artifacts left out there that we're able to photograph and things like that.
Sure.
If I could jump in and ask just a curiosity question about the process, what does that look like? David, do you finish writing something and it's polished, you're done with it, and then you hand it over to Jerry and say, now we need to match the art to it? Or is this a back and forth ongoing dialogue where you've got a rough draft, he finds some photos, and that then affects the text copy, and that you're working together? What does that process for the two of you look like in a book like this?
Well, first of all, I'm a storyboarder. I learned that when I was consulting with Disney in the 70s and 80s. So I storyboard a project and try to start with an outline. Then I always send the outline to Jerry, and he says something like, oh, this should be here, that should be there, you forgot this other thing. And the very best feedback I get from people is, what's missing, what should be here that's not. Harry Leslie did that for me a couple times and did me a real favor.
Wow, that's a great point. And also, I would like to ask you, David, there are a number of personalities that are highlighted in this book, but two of the ones that really struck me were Otto Jennings, and who is the famous botanist and a man from Pittsburgh, and also everything we've heard about Joe Root and the stories and the myth and everything else, but you really went into detail a very bittersweet story with Joe Root, and an instructive story about succession and other phenomena at the Peninsula. Can you tell us about that?
Well, two different people, but they're both extraordinarily important. I made it to the Warren State Hospital where I had an inn, and I found the original medical files. I was able to track down the questions that they asked Joe Root that helped them to determine that he was criminally insane and had to be moved from the Erie almshouse to Warren. And I saw what happened to him when he was there. He was medicated, over-medicated. He escaped 3 times. He didn't know where he was. He was captured. He became depressed and died at the end. That's a bigger story than most people realize, and it's very sad. The story of Jennings is interesting. I'm an academic, and so I can follow academic literature and read most every discipline. Jennings was not really qualified to write about succession. He was a botanist, and he made loads of technical academic mistakes in his writing about succession. So even though he's held in high regard as the guy that explained how Presque Isle has been growing, and he did a fairly good job of that, you'll find him vigorously criticized in his own literature where he didn't belong. So he was an accidental succession guy. He started out wondering where you could see a lot of plants without walking too far. He was working in the western end of Lake Erie, came down here and discovered Presque Isle by accident.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's one of the things that stands out to me. I love the title of the book, Accidental Paradise. And I, like I said, I don't want to give it all away. I want to encourage people to go get the book, and you can find out more information at accidentalparadise.com about it. But I love that title. And one of the other people that comes in mind for me is the story, David, that you tell about Andrew Carnegie and how Presque Isle may not have been a state park, but rather an industrial complex or a site of industry. Can you give us just a little bit of insight to that, a sneak peek to what you cover with Andrew Carnegie in the steel mill that almost was but never happened on Presque Isle?
Well, the people from Erie, Pennsylvania, the wealthy folks, were hustling Carnegie, trying to get him to come here and build a steel mill in Presque Isle. They offered him Presque Isle, and they imagined that they owned it and they could do that. And Carnegie came up here, and they took him for the cook's tour of the bay in a fish tug. And when he noticed all the piles of iron ore, etc., on the docks, he had another idea. So he went down the lake a bit, visited Cuneo, and he decided to go there instead. And I think Jerry knows more about that than I do. Go, Jerry.
Well, I think one of the reasons Carnegie couldn't settle here is the Pennsylvania Railroad pretty much owned all of the bayfront property, and they weren't real interested in getting another competition started here. Thank God he didn't set in at the Peninsula, because if you look at the huge complex he put in at Cuneo, and the plan was to use that as a kind of a lake port for a steel mill, because there was some plans at one time to build a steel mill just on a Pennsylvania and Ohio border. So I think mainly the reason he couldn't get here is the Pennsylvania Railroad had already they owned, they were leased all the land right along, except for the public dock area. They had it all.
One of the other chapters, sections of the book that stands out to me, and Jerry, we can start with you and go over to David to round it out. But I remember remarking to Pat about this when I first read it. The Waldemere section, it just really drew me in. That one I read again, not because the writing was bad and I felt like I had to check it, but because I really enjoyed that. It was just it was a great capturing, and we're talking about the people of Presque Isle and what's happened there. Jerry, get us started about the Waldemere discussion.
Well, Waldemere is, of course, stands for Woods by the Sea. It's a German name for it. It was actually started early on, and it was eventually acquired by one of the Erie trolley companies, the Erie Electric Motor Company. And what they need is, on weekends, we started to go into the 7-day work week or 5-day work week. They needed to generate business on a weekend. So Waldemere was built, and it was serviced by the trolley company. There was another one at 4 Mile Creek, serviced by the same company, which is called 4 Mile Creek Park. There was another one located at Elk Creek Park. It was run by the Cuneo and Erie Traction Company. And the Buffalo and Erie Traction Company had another one at Orchard Beach Park down in the Northeast. So these trolley parks were a big drawing for traffic on a weekend and gave people someplace to go. And it was a natural for us because it was a beautiful area. In fact, it's hard to believe what Waldameer has changed into. Initially, it was just a figure-8 roller coaster, a trolley stop, and a couple of dance halls. But boy, as it grew, it changed. There was a lot more activity along the beach. That's been closed for years. Dave and I had occasion to meet with the owner of Waldameer here a couple of years ago, and he's a fascinating guy. Tell us about what his plans were and what used to be. So I thought that was a really important part of it. I think the road to Waldameer also led to Presque Isle. So I think hadn't Waldameer been there, they may have run down there differently.
So David, tell us a little bit about the people behind Waldameer, and did the two of you get some free roller coaster Ravine Flyer 2 rides out of all of this research?
No, we didn't get free rides. We paid our own way. I was on the Ravine Flyer when it opened, of course, with my wonderful wife, enjoying the thrill. I love roller coasters, but some of the best stories about the park are the stories about the land that encroached the park. The stories not just about Waldameer, but Algeria and Tracy Farms and all the hotels that were down at the head, the stories of the head. And some of those best stories actually came from Sean Candela, who remembered old family stories. He had wonderful pictures to show me about how his dad really bought the property from Scott's daughter, Annie Scott, and developed so much of it.
In that same vein, David, you do some remarkable work that I believe you must have scored information from Paul Nelson on the construction of Peninsula Drive and how that struck, with air rights and also where it ended up. Tell us, what the visual was.
Well, Paul understanding that and it wasn't Paul that made these decisions, it was his predecessor, Alex Muller. They had the only real safe, lovely freshwater beach, and that was before Presque Isle opened. And they could see that if Presque Isle opened and there was a road that went that way, that they were going to suffer, and they had to make some sort of business adjustments. And so a lot of what they were doing was trying to figure out how to protect their own piece of the action there and somehow grab up people. And what's instructive to think about is, prior to the middle 1930s and the 40s, most people that went to places like Waldameer or Presque Isle didn't drive in a car. They went in a bus, they went in a trolley car, or they went in a ferry. And that's the amazing thing that's happened at Waldameer is how they've adapted to that. And I just tell you, I had some frightening meetings with Paul Nelson. He'd say, Dave, today we're going to walk up to the top of the Ravine Flyer. Come on, let's go. And he's like a madman. 87 years old, if I recall correctly. He's striding up to the top of the roller coaster in the spring and standing on top of a water slide, talking to people about how to do the fiberglass work, etc. He's just a great guy.
And I think that's one of the things that's captured so well in the book is I refer them lovingly as characters that we meet in the book, the people, and they really shine through in these stories. David, you had mentioned, that, it wasn't always cars, by how people were getting to Presque Isle. And that makes me think of traffic and the attention paid in the book to the roads on Presque Isle and how we would maneuver around it. Jerry, can you give us a little bit of insight to what you were finding throughout that process when it came to navigating Presque Isle?
At the time, the waterworks in Erie was deeded, or at least a section of the park, so they could run a filtration plant over at the park to bring fresh water into the city. Up till then, they had been taking water out of the bay and also discharging the sewage in the Mill Creek into the bay. So we had some different diseases crop up, and they needed to get a fresh water. So that's when the Erie Waterworks took over. And the only way they could get back and forth to service their plant was by boat. And they had a caretaker and everybody lived out there. So up till then, that was the only way. And as the when the park became a state park, they decided they needed a road. So there were several possibilities. One was to run it down a current road, which went to the head hotels. Nolan back then wanted to build a causeway from about Cranberry Street over to the park to allow traffic to go over that. And then finally they settled on a current route today, which ran right through the Waldemar Park property and into the park. And initially it was built in several stages because the first road was only completed as far as the waterworks area. And then as the park became a state park, they started adding sections to it, trying to get as far as the Perry Monument by the time of its dedication and all the way around. And it was kind of a reverse loop. It was one lane on and one lane off that just went a reverse loop around the park. But if you can, I can remember as a kid on a Sunday afternoon, if a rainstorm came up, the traffic would jam up, the cars would overheat, the horns would blow, and it was just a terrible nuisance getting off the park. So then back in the late 50s, they decided to add the roads we have today. And basically we have 2 lanes on, 2 lanes off. And it was a big deal because I think it opened up, more people could use the park. And again, before that time, you could only take a ferry boat over, or you could go over by boat to Lynn.
In that same vein, Jerry, much of the book has to do with before the state park and then after the state park, and the breaches that exist, the breach that existed for most of or almost half of a decade, including right before the time of the creation of the state park. How did you deal with it? You photographed where the breach is even today, as I recall.
Well, initially there were some maps. There were actually plans. The Army Corps of Engineers, 1835, I believe, is when the first breach occurred, and it remained an island until the 1860s. There were different methods trying to close it up, but there was actually a plan by the Army Corps of Engineers to have 2 entrances into the bay, and one was on the west and one was on the east. I bought a map from eBay. It was published in 1835. It showed the plans for the break walls and the entrance on the west side. And again, it was finally closed up. And again, it broke through again about 1915, I think it was, and it was that way till at least 1922. And after that, it was necessary to, because it was a state park now, they closed it up, and it's been that way ever since.
So I want to jump in there with the state park. And remind people, though, who maybe haven't been to Presque Isle, non-Erie residents tuning into the program, one of the, I think, beautiful entrances to the park is the fact that Ravine Flyer 2, the rebuild of the wooden coaster, actually goes right across over the road. So you drive underneath it and get to interact with both Waldemar, the amusement park, and Presque Isle, the state park. David, can you give us a little bit background of the characters and people behind really championing the cause of getting Presque Isle to be a state park?
Well, the single most important person who's an unsung hero is a fellow by the name of Sobel. And he was the chairman of the state Republican Party, a person who fancied himself to be a consultant and fixer of things. He rescued Hammett from bankruptcy. He went to work at the post office and showed them a system for making it viable. He was doing all these wonderful things, and he was a devout religious person, and he met twice a week with the men's group. And the men's group used to try to tackle pressing community issues. And in the years before Presque Isle became a state park, there was loads of people taking advantage of the place. There was logging going out there, market hunting, trapping, all kinds of crazy stuff happening. And the Sobel group got concerned that if enough of this bad stuff happened to destroy the trees and the roots systems, that Presque Isle could literally wash away and we would lose our harbor. So he went to work, and their solution to that was to make Presque Isle into a national park. So they did a lot of work on creating a very sophisticated, I got to read it in the archives at the Jewish Temple, proposal to make Presque Isle into a national park, which was rejected. And he was crushed by that. He just couldn't imagine himself failing. So as a secondary idea, he put pressure on the state government to make it a state park. The state government made him a deal that they thought he wouldn't be able to comply with. They said, okay, if you can raise this much money, we'll throw in the rest and you'll be a state park. They didn't want it to happen. They didn't think it could happen. They were totally skeptical. And of course, Sobel was the kind of guy that he already had about 2/3 of the money lined up in pledges before he was down there pledging. So they gave him 9 months to raise the money. He had all the money plus 20% in 3 months, and we're off and running. A genius guy.
That is an amazing story. David, also our conversation wouldn't be complete if we didn't discuss Crystal Point and Perry Monument, as well as Presque Isle Lighthouse, which are two of the wonderful, great features, along with the Coast Guard, Horseshoe Pond. How does that fit into your narrative?
Well, Crystal Point was a bad and scary place in the early days of the city because there was nefarious things going there, and you could get there in a rowboat. So there was all kinds of people going to Crystal Point doing wild and terrible things like drinking and staying overnight. There was a proprietor out there that had a house that he slept in, which was against the rules and regulations. So everybody was really anxious to clean that up. And one of the things that happened when Presque Isle became a state park is they get rid of all the bad stuff that was happening. They cleaned that up. And of course, the roots of what went on at Misery Bay, there was a competition between Ohio and Pennsylvania, friendly competition, to see who could build and open a monument first to celebrate the War of 1812 and the Battle of Lake Erie. And of course, their monument is bigger and quote unquote, maybe taller, better, but ours got done first. The dilemma was that it was done before the road was there. So they went to celebrate the opening of the monument, and they had to take people over in boats. And probably Jerry's in a better position to talk about the lighthouse.
Well, being born and raised and living on Lighthouse Street my whole life, I like lighthouses. And of course, our first lighthouse was the first land lighthouse, was built in 1813 or 1819, I'm sorry. And from there, it was rebuilt 2 more times to the current structure, which is all sandstone, up to then been wood. And they decided that a better position for a lighthouse would be on the park itself. So they went over the other side about 1860, I think, and built another lighthouse on that side. And that was actually built a brick. The walls are about a foot thick. The whole thing is brick, and it is actually, I think it was 12 foot added to it later on to make it a little taller. It was operated and maintained by a lighthouse keeper for many, many years, until it was taken over by the Coast Guard, and made put on automatic. For a while there, the residence at the lighthouse was used by park personnel as a home, and of course now it belongs. It's been leased from the federal government, or given to the park by the state. By the federal government, and it's been leased to the Lighthouse Commission. And we have a third lighthouse, if people don't really realize it, but we call it the Pierhead Light, which is located on the North Pier. It helps guide the ships into the channel. It actually had a keeper and had people who took care of it for many years, and of course it was set on automatic. Lighthouse has had an awful lot of nice work done to it. It's really, really something to see. Unfortunately, like everything else, it's been closed. And living in the shadow of the land lighthouse, you acquire a love to them.
One of the things I admire about that is the tales of people living in the lighthouse and what it took to make that happen. And in fact, families their children would have to catch a ferry across to get to school, leaving Presque Isle. So a very serious question here, show of hands. Who would spend a winter in the Presque Isle lighthouse if they had the opportunity to live there? I know I would.
Got mine.
All right, so Pat, you're the only one that says no to that? Okay, all right. All of us.
How much bourbon?
you get a good barrel out there, at least one good barrel. So I appreciate that. One of the other things that we talked about earlier was Waldemar, the entrance of Presque Isle, and we were talking about some of the things deeper in on Presque Isle. One of the other things that we see as we approach Presque Isle, the road down to it, is the Tom Ridge Environmental Center. And turns out Presque Isle plays an important role in Tom Ridge's life. Erie native, governor of Pennsylvania, and the first director of the Department of Homeland Security. David, explain just a little bit in brief about Tom Ridge and the Tom Ridge Environmental Center. We want to thank them again for the sale of the books, accidentalparadise.com information for their handling of this book there. David, Tom Ridge and Presque Isle, the connection.
Well, Tom Ridge as a boy used to go to Presque Isle every weekend. His family would take him out there for a picnic and swimming. He grew up loving the park. And then as a youngster, a young man, he got a job working on the maintenance crew out there. There's loads of great stories told in the book about some of the exploits of Tom as the maintenance guy out there. And then he went on to have this fantastic career and came back in a way to provide so much help for Presque Isle. There would be no Ridge Center without Tom Ridge. And of course, people had to fight him to generate the money to do it and to let it be named after him. That wasn't his idea at all.
Humble, great guy. I'm going to ask one other question, and then Pat, maybe we'll kick it over to you. David, in your intro, you talked about wanting to not get busted by the park police. And Jerry, you talked about some of the operations of the parks. Jerry, I want to kick it over to you to tell us a little bit about the park police, the role they play, and what readers of this book, as they get it, Accidental Paradise, can look for about the park police.
Well, the first police officer was actually hired by the park was by the waterworks people. The people on the waterworks decided they needed a caretaker, so they not only made him a caretaker, but they also made him a sworn Erie police officer. And I was able to kind of keep the place under control. And he ended up being, of course, the chief police as they added more officers. And they provided a horse for him to work on, to patrol the area. And horses were not unusual out there because there was a bridle path that ran all the way from the Tracy Farms onto the peninsula. And so horses were not unusual. In fact, a friend of mine gave me a copy of a home video that his parents took back in 1942. And here's a person on horseback riding down the middle of the road at the park. And he probably came down a bridle path. So then it kind of evolved. They added more people. They built the original police barracks, which is now the Stahl Center. Was original police barracks that was built in the 1930s, and they had a headquarters. They kind of grew between part-time and full-time. We're not allowed to disclose its full complement because that's a secret, but it's someplace around 12 officers full-time and whatever they hired in summertime. They were full-time police officers, and they worked for the state, and now they've been changed their designations and are called park rangers. And it's kind of funny because some of my close friends started their police career as park rangers and ended up at the Erie Police Department. In fact, one of our fellows was married to another park police woman, and so they both worked out there at one time. The crime at the park is kind of normal. There's car break-ins and little disorderly conduct. There's been a couple of homicide situations out there over the years, and of course they've been solved, but it's kind of a quiet place, safe, and generally with social media, what is if something happens out there, it's out there real quick, and they usually work on it pretty good.
Don't forget the important discussion of the space people that came here. Not to mention the green swamp monster. Those were two important events.
Well, that's funny. When I was a rookie on the Erie Police Department, this was during the time of the UFO sightings up to Presque Isle. And honest to God, I remember one summer night, we must have had 10 calls at the Erie Police Department talking about more UFOs. And I kept looking at the captain. I says, this is baloney. Why do I want to write a report on it? He says, write the report, kid. So I wrote the reports, and it turns out there were some kids got a hold of some cleaners bags and filled it with hot air and flashlights, and they would let them drift above the park from the hot air. There were stories of monsters. I'm not quite sure if there was any something like a Loch Ness monster. Somebody said they saw it. It could have been anything. It could have been a bunch of logs or things like that. But if you go to the Ridge Center now, they have a couple of displays highlighting those two incidents.
Well, they actually caught the green swamp monster.
Yeah, it looked like a pretty bad rubber suit, actually, didn't it?
Yeah, actually caught him. They pointed out that he had a leech on his ankle, and he collapsed. He fainted. Wasn't as tough as he thought.
I would just like to ask David. I think one of the real secrets of success to this book is that while it deals with all of these specific things and some very thorny issues and some great history, at the end, you write a very, very moving send-out about the future of the park and what it means to people and in so many different ways. Tell us how you came about to write that and what you were trying to get across.
Well, I spent a lot of time talking to a lot of people who loved that place. A lot of people who just love that place. And you can imagine how heartbroken people would be if we came to the point where we couldn't maintain it. So years and years and years ago, a controversial decision was made to engineer the shape. And now we're bound to maintain the engineered shape in perpetuity. There's no going back to the thing that Nolan, the city planner, recommended, and that was to let it take its own shape and do something different with the road. But we're in a fight now to replace the sand, given the high water. And one of the many places where I drove and talked to people was to Ohio State, not to the main campus in Columbus, but to the Sea Grant people, to ask them to help me to understand why the lake level was not going up and then coming back down as it was scheduled to do. So we're facing some scary times with respect to high water. And as Matt Green once said to me, he's going to the federal government begging for money for sand, and they're saying, do you think a higher priority would be to give sand to you so that you can have tourism on Presque Isle, or to give electricity and fresh water to people in Puerto Rico who are still struggling? And the same pot of money has to fund both of those things. So where we're going to get the sand and how much more sand we're going to need and how many more years it may be before the water level starts to recede, those are mysteries that haven't been solved yet.
You know, you've also drawn great attention to HABs, the hazardous algal blooms, and the mistakes that were made, such as cutting the lagoons through the center of the park. What message would you like to give to the those who go to the peninsula, love the peninsula? What message do you think they need to hear and receive?
Well, all of us that go there, the millions of people that go every year, and I'm maybe 200,000 of them myself, if you count axles, we have to be prepared to do what we can to support the struggle, the struggle to sustain this place. And it's going to be a struggle. Those people deserve our help and our support, rather than the moaning and complaining that sometimes we see.
So as we near the end of the program here, like I said, I don't want to give everything away. I want to encourage people to go and get this book. I think it's fantastic. I can't recommend it enough. I'm one of those people too that gets out to Presque Isle as much as we can. I value it, and I value knowing so much more about it. There was a lot that surprised me as I was reading it. I thought I knew quite a bit about Presque Isle. It turns out I didn't. I learned a lot in this. The three of you, David, Jerry, Pat, you're Erie guys, you're historians, you're each talented researchers, writers, editors. What surprised you when coming across this material, researching it, writing and editing it? Jerry, can I start with you? What surprised you the most when you were working on this project?
I think what surprised me the most is how little I think how much we take the park for granted. It's a fragile piece of real estate, and I think people in the community have to learn to respect it and conserve it. And I don't think right now, not everybody feels that way.
David, for you, what surprised you when you were researching, writing, and editing, working on this project?
Well, I got interested in calculating the percentage of time between recorded charting by the Corps of Engineers in 1921 that there was an actual channel through the West End, and it was in excess of 60%. So when Nolan came here, the esteemed city planner in 1913, and made recommendations, he said, you can't fight that. You really don't want to take on the responsibility of engineering a shape and putting a road there. And we also got a hold of, and Jerry has a copy of this as well, a 1923 aerial survey of the park that shows that the neck of the peninsula might have been a couple of 100 feet wide without a blade of grass growing on it, tops. So we've created something there to hold a road that is going to be difficult to sustain.
So in any process, the editor gets the final word. So chief editor for Accidental Paradise, Pat, what surprised you when you were going through this book? Somebody who's been looking at Presque Isle all his life, what caught your eye?
I think it's perfectly titled, and I know a lot of that has to do with Dave and Marianne Frew, but it is an accidental paradise, paved with good intentions that somehow worked out. And this is such a great place. And not only that, can you imagine the Erie region without Presque? Well, you can't, because it would be horrific. And it underscores not just the quality of the lake water and the successful nurturing of the peninsula and the politics that go into the place. This needs our #1 attention priority. Now, as an East Sider, I would say it could use an East Side access. However, that's a controversial subject. But I think Accidental Paradise perfectly titled. And it was such a joy for me to work with these great pros.
And perfectly titled for the website, accidentalparadise.com. That's where you can find out more information about this book, when to order it, how to order it, and more details, all surrounding a wonderful look, a 13,000-year history of Presque Isle, the gem of Erie. Dr. David Frew, Mr. Jerry Scripzak, Mr. Patrick Cuneo, thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise and taking the time, energy, and effort to share them with us here in this Jefferson Educational Society digital program. And a big thanks to the many folks who helped in this project. Some of those names you're going to find on the cover of the book. Some of those names you're going to find in the interior of the book. They helped make this project become a reality, including the Tom Ridge Environmental Center Foundation. For that information on how, where, and when to purchase Accidental Paradise, the 13,000-year history of Presque Isle, please do visit the Trek Foundation's website for the book, accidentalparadise.com. And of course, thank you all watching along at home, tuning in live on the Jefferson Educational Society Facebook page, or watching a later broadcast of this. Thank you for being a part of Jefferson Educational Society digital programming. Friendly reminder to stream other JES digital programs on demand. Head over to our website, jeserie.org. There you're going to find details about upcoming programming, as well as a wide range of publications, including a lot from Dr. David Frew on the Waterfront series. Quick, timely reads, reports, essays, and so much more, free to download, jeserie.org. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Speggen. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.